The forging of a weapon. The plan, codenamed Operation Anthropoid, was born not in the heat of passion, but in the cold, meticulous offices of the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, in London. By late 1941, the SOE, tasked by Winston Churchill to set Europe ablaze, had become the forge for the Allied world's most daring unconventional warfare missions. The request from the Czechoslovak government in exile was, however, unprecedented in its audacity. They didn't want to sabotage a factory or blow up a bridge. They wanted to eliminate a single man, arguably the third most powerful figure in the Third Reich after Hitler and Himmler. The target, Reinhard Heydrich, was not merely a governor, he was the very embodiment of the Nazi security state. As chief of the RSHA, his authority encompassed the Gestapo, secret state police, the Kripo, criminal police, and the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the SS intelligence service. He was the logistical mastermind behind the Einsatzgruppen death squads and was in the process of organizing the industrial-scale extermination of European Jewry. Killing him would be like plunging a knife into the brain of the Nazi terror apparatus. The selection process for the assassins was rigorous, overseen by Colonel František Moravec, the head of Czechoslovak military intelligence in exile. He needed men who were not just brave, but resilient, intelligent, and fanatically dedicated. They had to be young enough to be molded, but experienced enough to survive. From a pool of 2,000 exiled Czech soldiers training in Britain, 2 were chosen, Warrant Officer Josef Gapsik and Staff Sergeant Karel Svoboda. Gapsik, a Slovak locksmith by trade, was tough, fiery, and a natural leader. Svoboda was steady and reliable. They were dispatched to the SOE's secretive RSHA training grounds in the rugged Scottish Highlands. There, they were immersed in the dark arts of the saboteur, handling plastic explosives, silent killing techniques, clandestine communication, and parachute jumping. However, during a training jump, Svoboda sustained a head injury, forcing him out of the mission. A replacement was needed, and fast. The choice fell upon Jan Kubis. A Czech from Moravia, Kubis was quieter and more introspective than Gapsik, but possessed a calm, unshakable resolve that complemented his partner's impetuous nature perfectly. They were a study in contrasts, the fiery Slovak and the steady Czech, but a bond of absolute trust was quickly forged between them. They understood the stakes. This was not a mission from which they were expected to return. They were living weapons, forged in Scotland, aimed at the heart of Prague. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The Descent into Darkness. On the night of December 28, 1941, the biting wind howled around the fuselage of a Royal Air Force Halifax bomber as it lumbered through the skies over occupied Europe. Inside, Josef Gapsik and Jan Kubis made their final checks. Their military uniforms had been replaced with civilian clothes, their pockets filled with forged identity papers, cyanide capsules, and a small fortune in German Reichsmarks. Strapped to their bodies were pistols and the primary tool for their mission, a specially modified Sten submachine gun for Gapsik and several custom-built anti-tank grenades for Kubis. The mission had already deviated from the plan. The original target drop zone was near the city of Pilsen, where they were to make contact with established resistance cells. However, due to navigational difficulties and heavy snow cover that obscured ground landmarks, the pilots were flying partially blind. The green light flashed. Gapsik and Kubis, along with members of 2 other clandestine teams, Silver A and Silver B, plunged out of the aircraft's belly and into the freezing blackness. They landed not near Pilsen, but near Nevezdy, a village east of Prague. The disorientation was immediate. They were miles off course, in unfamiliar territory, and had sustained minor injuries during the landing. One of their crucial supply canisters was lost in the snow. This initial error proved to be a twisted blessing. The Gestapo, having been tipped off about a potential paratrooper drop, had intensified their security around the Pilsen area. The navigational mistake had inadvertently allowed Gapsik and Kubis to slip through the net. Their first task was survival and concealment. They buried their parachutes and harnesses in the frozen earth, a task made Herculean by the biting cold and the fear of discovery. They made their way to a local quarry to hide, their breath pluming in the frigid air, every distant dog bark or passing vehicle sending jolts of adrenaline through them. Their training had prepared them for combat, but not for this profound sense of isolation. They were utterly alone, two specters in their own occupied homeland, with the entire might of the German security apparatus unknowingly arrayed against them. Their only guide was a compass, their only hope the network of patriots they prayed still existed in the city of Prague. Weaving the web in Prague. The first few weeks of 1942 were a masterclass in clandestine survival. Gapsik and Kubis, with the help of local contacts they cautiously established, made their way into Prague. The city was a paradox, outwardly normal with trams rattling and citizens going about their daily routines, but underscored by a palpable tension. Swastika banners hung from buildings that had once borne the Czech lion, and the presence of SS uniforms was a constant, chilling reminder of the occupation. Their mission's success depended entirely on the Czech resistance, a fractured and heavily persecuted network of brave souls. Through a chain of contacts originating from the Silver A team, they were introduced to a web of families and individuals who would become their lifeline. People like the Moravia family, Marie, Alois, and their son Ada, turned their apartment into a de facto command center, a hub of quiet, desperate activity. Jan Zelenka, a schoolteacher and a leader in the Sokol gymnastics organization, a hotbed of patriotic activity, became their principal guide and organizer in the city. These were not soldiers or spies in the traditional sense, they were ordinary people, doctors, butchers, teachers, housewives, who made the extraordinary decision to risk everything. They provided Gapsik and Kubis with shelter, moving them from one safe house to another every few days to avoid detection. They secured new, more convincing false documents, gathered intelligence, and acted as lookouts. The psychological strain on both the assassins and their helpers was immense. Every knock on the door, every stranger's gaze that lingered too long, could signal the end. For Gapsik and Kubis, there was the added frustration of delay. They had been trained for swift, decisive action, but the reality was a painstaking process of reconnaissance. They needed to understand Heydrich's routine. Where did he live? What route did he take to his office at Prague Castle, the ancient seat of Bohemian kings now defiled by the Reichsprotector? How heavy was his security? This information trickled in slowly, gathered by tram workers who noted his cars passing, by insiders who overheard whispers, and by a brave few who dared to watch his movements. During this time, the assassins lived a phantom existence, seeing the city of their youth as a hostile landscape, its familiar streets now a chessboard for a game of life and death. The predator's routine. Reinhard Heydrich was a man consumed by both arrogance and ambition. He resided in a confiscated chateau at Panec-Breziny, a village north of Prague. From here, he would commute daily to his command center at Prague Castle. The intelligence gathered by the resistance, painstakingly assembled by Zelenka-Hatschki's network, began to paint a picture of the Reichsprotector's habits. Heydrich, in a display of supreme confidence and contempt for the Czechs he ruled, often traveled in an open-topped, dark green Mercedes-Benz 320C convertible. More astonishingly, he frequently dispensed with a heavy armed escort, typically traveling with only his driver, SS-Obergruppenführer Johannes Klein. This arrogance was the vulnerability Gapsik and Kubis had been searching for. It was a crack in the armor of the seemingly invincible Nazi regime. The assassins and their handlers began to scout potential ambush locations along his daily route. Weeks were spent observing, timing, and planning. They considered an attack within the dense woods outside Prague, but the risk of being spotted and the difficulty of escape were too high. Another plan involved stretching a steel cable across the road to stop the car, but this was deemed too complex. Finally, they settled on a location in the Prague suburb of Holsovice. Here, the road from the north made a sharp, almost 90-degree hairpin turn as it descended a hill to cross the Vltava River via the Troja Bridge. This curve would force Heydrich's Mercedes to slow down dramatically, presenting a near-stationary target for a precious few seconds. The location was perfect. It was an urban area, allowing the assassins to blend in with pedestrians at a tram stop right at the corner. Escape routes were plentiful through the surrounding streets and gardens. The date was set. The plan was refined to its brutal essentials. Josef Gapsik would position himself on the outside of the curve. As the Mercedes slowed, he would step forward and riddle the car and its occupants with his Sten gun. Jan Kubis would be positioned slightly further back, ready with his specially designed grenades as a backup, or to finish the job if Gapsik's gun failed. A third operative, Josef Valsik, from the Silver A team, would be stationed about 100 yards up the hill to signal the car's approach with a small mirror. The trap was set. Now, all they had to do was wait for the hangman to keep his appointment with destiny. May 27, 1942, the appointment in Holsovis. The morning of May 27, 1942, dawned bright and deceptively placid. A nervous energy crackled between Gapsik and Kubis. For 5 months, they had lived in the shadows, their existence a tightly wound spring of tension. Today, it would be released. Dressed as workmen, they took a tram to Holsovis, their weapons concealed. Gapsik carried his Sten gun, hidden under his raincoat, disassembled in a briefcase. Kubis had his powerful grenades in his own case. They arrived at the hairpin turn shortly after 9 a.m. Josef Valsik took his position up the hill, his small pocket mirror ready. Gapsik paced near the tram stop at the apex of the curve, while Kubis waited across the street. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Trams clattered past. Civilians came and went, oblivious to the history about to be made at this unremarkable street corner. 10 a.m. came and went. Then 10:15. A knot of anxiety tightened in their stomachs. Had he changed his route? Was the intelligence wrong? In his chateau, Heydrich had indeed been delayed. He had spent extra time with his family before his planned departure for a new post in Paris, a promotion for his exemplary work in the Protectorate. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Valsik caught the glint of the sun off the approaching dark green Mercedes. He flashed his mirror. The signal was given. Down the hill, Gapsik saw the glint and casually moved to the edge of the pavement, fumbling to assemble the Sten gun under his coat. Kubis gripped his briefcase, his knuckles white. The open-topped Mercedes, with its fluttering SS pennant, began to slow for the turn. The blond, hawk-like features of Reinhard Heydrich were clearly visible in the passenger seat. As the car drew level with him, Gapsik threw off his raincoat, stepped into the road, raised the Sten gun, and took aim. He squeezed the trigger. Click. Nothing. A jam. A catastrophic failure at the most critical second imaginable. Heydrich and his driver, Klein, saw the would-be assassin. In a fatal moment of hubris, instead of ordering Klein to accelerate away, Heydrich yelled at him to stop. He stood up, drawing his Luger pistol to engage the attacker himself. As the Mercedes braked, Kubis, seeing Gapsik's failure, sprang into action. He ran forward and lobbed his grenade towards the car. It fell short, not landing inside the vehicle but detonating against the right rear fender. The explosion was deafening. Black smoke and shrapnel ripped through the air, shattering the car's windows and blowing out the windows of a nearby tram. The Hangman of Prague was down. Chaos and escape. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was a pandemonium of smoke, shattered glass, and screams. The force of the blast had blown the car door off its hinges and embedded a spray of shrapnel into the upholstery and the bodies of its occupants. Both Jan Kubis and Reinhard Heydrich were wounded by the grenade fragments. Kubis was struck in the face, the shrapnel grazing his eye, and was momentarily dazed. Heydrich, despite his wounds, staggered out of the wrecked car, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He and his driver, Klein, both drew their pistols. The plan had devolved into a chaotic street fight. Josef Gapsik, having discarded the useless Sten gun, drew his Colt pistol and exchanged fire with Klein, who chased him up the hill towards the butcher's shops. The street, moments before a scene of mundane morning traffic, was now a battlefield. Meanwhile, Heydrich, fueled by adrenaline, stumbled after Kubis, firing his Luger until the magazine was empty. He was clearly injured, clutching his side, but his predatory instinct remained. Kubis, bleeding from his face, jumped on his bicycle and pedaled furiously away, firing his own pistol back at the pursuing SS general. The sight was surreal, the all-powerful Reichsprotector, wounded and on foot, vainly trying to shoot a fleeing assassin in the middle of a Prague suburb. The escape was a desperate, fragmented affair. Gapsik, pursued by Klein, ducked into a butcher's shop. The butcher, a patriot named František Bronner, misdirected Klein, allowing Gapsik to slip out the back and escape into the dense warren of residential streets. Kubis, after his initial bike escape, had to abandon the vehicle and disappear into the crowd, his face bleeding. Joseph Valsik, his signaling duty done, had vanished discreetly as planned. Heydrich, his strength failing, finally collapsed against the bonnet of his ruined car. A Czech woman, seeing the high-ranking Nazi in distress, rushed to his aid. Through gritted teeth, Heydrich gasped, "Get that bastard," before slumping to the pavement. A delivery van was commandeered to take him to Bulovka Hospital, just a short distance away. As the van sped off, carrying the architect of the Holocaust, the assassins melted back into the very city they had just thrown into chaos. They were wounded, separated, and hunted, but their primary objective was complete. The invincible hangman had been struck down. The question now was, at what cost? A deceptive recovery and a fatal diagnosis. Reinhard Heydrich arrived at Bulovka Hospital conscious and incandescent with rage. He initially refused treatment from Czech doctors, demanding an SS physician. The hospital director, Dr. Dick, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation and began emergency procedures. The initial examination revealed what appeared to be a non-life-threatening wound. A piece of shrapnel had entered Heydrich's back, fracturing a rib and puncturing his diaphragm and spleen. There were no bullets in his body, the damage was all from the grenade. Professor Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician and a specialist in trauma surgery, was flown in from Berlin. Under his supervision, the Czech surgeons, led by Professor Holbaum, performed the operation. They removed the fractured rib and, most critically, the damaged spleen. During the surgery, the surgeons discovered that the shrapnel had carried debris deep into Heydrich's body cavity, fragments of metal, but also horsehair and textile fibers from the car's upholstery. The wound was meticulously cleaned, and the surgery was deemed a success. For the next few days, a strange and deceptive calm descended. Heydrich appeared to be making a remarkable recovery. He was lucid, meeting with SS officials from his hospital bed, and his fever began to subside. The Nazi leadership in Berlin breathed a sigh of relief. Himmler himself visited his protégé, assured of his recovery. From his bed, a vengeful Heydrich helped orchestrate the first wave of brutal reprisals. A state of emergency was declared in Prague. A curfew was imposed, and the SS and Gestapo began a terrifying citywide manhunt. The initial announcement offered a reward of 10 million Czech crowns for information leading to the assassin's capture. But deep within Heydrich's body, a far more insidious enemy was at work. The horsehair fibers from the upholstery had introduced bacteria into his bloodstream, leading to a massive systemic infection. The newly developed sulfonamide antibiotics, which could have potentially saved his life, were available. However, Professor Gebhardt, out of a bizarre sense of professional arrogance or a belief that his patient's robust constitution would prevail, declined to administer them. On June 3, Heydrich's condition took a sudden, catastrophic turn. He fell into a coma. The infection had overwhelmed his system. On the morning of June 4, 1942, 8 days after the attack, Reinhard Heydrich, the Hangman of Prague, died of septicemia. The news hit the Nazi hierarchy like a thunderclap. Their golden prince was dead. The beast they had unleashed had been slain, but its death throes would be terrible beyond imagining. The scourge of literacy. The death of Reinhard Heydrich triggered a wave of retributive fury unparalleled in occupied Western Europe. Hitler, upon hearing the news, was reported to have screamed for the execution of 10,000 Czechs. While he was eventually calmed by Karl Hermann Frank, Heydrich's deputy in Prague, the thirst for vengeance was insatiable. The manhunt, codenamed Operation REX, intensified to a fever pitch. Mass arrests became commonplace. Thousands were summarily executed without trial. The Gestapo's torture chambers at the Petchek Palace worked day and night. The entire Protectorate was sealed off. The reward was doubled to 20 million crowns. But the assassins remained hidden, protected by the silence of a terrified but resolute population. The Nazis needed a scapegoat, a symbol to terrorize the nation into submission. They found it in a small, unassuming mining village northwest of Prague, Lidice. The connection to Lidice was tenuous at best, fabricated from a coerced confession and a misunderstanding. The Gestapo had intercepted a letter that vaguely hinted at a connection between a man from the village and the resistance. It was a lie, but it was enough. On the evening of June 9th, SS and German police units surrounded the village. In the early morning of June 10th, the horror began. All 173 men and boys over the age of 15 were rounded up and locked in a farmhouse cellar. They were then led out in groups of 10 to the garden wall, where they were systematically shot. The women and children were separated. The 184 women were transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where most would perish. The children, numbering around 90, were taken to a camp in Lodz, Poland. A handful who were deemed racially suitable for Germanization were sent to German families. The remaining 82 were murdered, gassed in specially adapted vans at the Chelmno extermination camp. To erase Lidice from the map and from memory, German labor corps were brought in. They dynamited and bulldozed every building, rerouted the stream, filled in the village pond, and even dug up the dead in the cemetery. By the end, Lidice was nothing but a flat, empty field. The massacre was not hidden, it was announced with pride by the Nazi propaganda machine, a clear and brutal message to the world: this is the price of defiance. The betrayal. While the smoke cleared over the flattened ground of Lidice, the assassins and their comrades remained hidden. Gapsik, Kubis, and 5 other paratroopers, Joseph Valsik, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Bublik, Jan Ruby, and Yaroslav Svark, had found their final sanctuary in the crypt of the Saints Cyril and Methodius Cathedral in Prague. The church, led by Bishop Gorazd and other brave Orthodox priests, provided them with this last, desperate refuge. They were brought food and news of the outside world by the heroic members of their support network, including the women who had nursed their wounds and hidden them in their homes. But the Gestapo's net was tightening. The relentless pressure, the mass executions, the sheer terror of the reprisals, and the enormous reward were beginning to fracture the will of the weaker links in the resistance. The betrayal, when it came, was not from a Gestapo informant or a Nazi sympathizer, but from within their own ranks. The traitor was Karel Kurda, a fellow paratrooper from the outdistance team, who had been dropped into Czechoslovakia on a separate mission. Kurda had lost his nerve. Fleeing to his mother's home after losing his team's equipment, he lived in hiding, consumed by fear. The news of the Lidice massacre broke him completely. Seeking to save his family and himself, he took a train to Prague on June 16th. He walked into the Gestapo headquarters at the Petchek Palace and told them everything he knew. While Kurda did not know the assassins' final hiding place, he knew the names of their helpers. He identified the briefcases, the bicycle Kubis had ridden, and most damningly, he named the families who had provided the safe houses. He gave the Gestapo the key they needed to unravel the entire network. The Moravia family, who had been the heart of the Prague support system, was one of the first to be targeted. On the morning of June 17th, the Gestapo stormed their apartment. While they brutalized her husband and son Ada, Marie Moravec, with incredible presence of mind, asked to be allowed to use the toilet. There, she bit down on the cyanide capsule she had kept hidden. She died in seconds, taking her secrets with her. But under brutal interrogation and torture, her teenage son Ada eventually broke. He revealed the one secret his mother had died to protect: the paratroopers were hiding in the cathedral. The last stand at the cathedral. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 18, 1942, the trap sprung. Over 750 Waffen-SS troops, supplemented by Gestapo agents, cordoned off the area around the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius. The senior SS officer on the scene, Karl von Treuenfeld, expected a quick surrender. The paratroopers inside had other ideas. The 3 men acting as sentries in the church's main nave and choir loft, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Bublik, and Jan Kubis, were the first to engage. From the windows and the organ loft, they opened fire on the overwhelming force below, their pistol shots and the occasional burst from a Sten gun echoing through the sacred space. The SS, shocked by the fierce resistance, responded with a torrent of machine gun fire and grenades, shattering the stained glass windows and chewing up the stone pillars. The firefight was intense and one-sided. After 2 hours of furious battle, the 3 defenders, wounded and out of ammunition, took their own lives with their last bullets rather than be captured. Kubis, the man whose grenade had mortally wounded Heydrich, was found unconscious from his wounds and died shortly after being taken to a hospital. The Germans knew there were more men below. They discovered the stone slab covering the entrance to the crypt. After failing to lift it, they brought in Karel Kurta, the traitor, who shouted down, "Surrender. Nothing will happen to you." The defiant reply from the crypt was a volley of gunfire. The SS then tried to storm the narrow opening, but were repeatedly driven back by the 4 men inside, Josef Gapsik, Joseph Valsik, Jaroslav Svark, and Jan Ruby. Desperate, the Germans called in the Prague Fire Brigade, ordering them to pump water into the crypt through the ventilation shaft to flood the paratroopers out. As the water level rose, the men inside returned fire through the shaft, pushing the fire hoses back out. The Germans then resorted to tossing tear gas canisters and explosives into the crypt, but the defenders refused to yield. For hours, the 4 men held off an army from their subterranean fortress. But they knew it was the end. The water was rising, their ammunition was dwindling, and capture meant torture and a degrading death. With the SS preparing for a final assault by blowing a new hole in the crypt wall, the 4 remaining heroes of Operation Anthropoid made their final choice. One by one, using their last bullets on themselves, they denied the hangman's executioners their final victory. Their 8-hour battle against impossible odds was a final, defiant testament to their unbreakable will. The wave of blood. The silence that fell over the cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius was not an end, but a beginning. With the bodies of the 7 paratroopers identified, their faces mutilated by bullets and water, but ultimately recognized with the help of the traitor Kurta, the Nazi regime unleashed the full, systematic horror of its vengeance. The battle at the cathedral was not a closure, it was the final piece of evidence the Gestapo needed. Armed with the knowledge gained from torturing the resistance network members identified by Kurta, the SS and Gestapo conducted a merciless purge. The heroes who had aided the assassins paid the ultimate price. Jan Zelenkahachsky, the schoolteacher and Sokol leader who had been the logistical soul of the operation, took poison before the Gestapo could capture him. The entire Moravec family, save for the tortured Ada who was sent to a concentration camp, was annihilated. Alois Moravec was executed alongside his son's fiancée. The reprisals extended to the Orthodox Church, which had provided the final sanctuary. Bishop Gorazd, the church priests, and senior lay leaders were arrested. They were brutally tortured and, on September 4, 1942, executed by firing squad. The Czechoslovak Orthodox Church was officially banned, its property confiscated, its clergy sent to labor camps. The terror was not confined to Prague. In the wake of Lidice, the Nazis sought another victim. The village of Lizaki, where the Silver A-Team had operated its radio transmitter, was targeted. On June 24, the village was surrounded. Unlike Lidice, Lizaki's connection to the resistance was direct. All 33 adults, both men and women, were shot. 13 children were taken away, 2 were selected for Germanization, the other 11 were gassed at Chelmno. The village was then razed to the ground. In total, it is estimated that over 5,000 people were murdered in the reprisals following Heydrich's assassination. 294 of the assassin's closest associates and family members were systematically rounded up and transported to Mauthausen concentration camp. On October 24, 1942, in a single, horrific day, all 262 who had survived the journey were executed, shot one by one in the back of the neck. The cost of killing the hangman was a river of Czech blood. The international reaction and shifting alliances. While the Protectorate bled, the world watched in horror and awe. The news of Heydrich's assassination, followed by the unspeakable brutality of the Lidice and Ležáky massacres, sent shockwaves across the Allied nations. Propaganda ministries seized upon the events. Lidice, in particular, became a powerful international symbol of Nazi barbarity. The story was broadcast globally, featured in films, poems, and songs. In the United States, towns were renamed Lidice in solidarity. In Britain, the Lidice Shall Live movement gained immense traction, raising funds to rebuild the village after the war. The martyrdom of Lidice galvanized public opinion and hardened Allied resolve, erasing any lingering vestiges of appeasement-era thinking. It laid bare the true nature of the regime they were fighting, not as a conventional political power, but as a murderous ideology that had to be destroyed completely. For the Czechoslovak government in exile, the political fallout was profound and, in a grim way, exactly what they had hoped for. The audacity of Operation Anthropoid and the horrific price paid by their people fundamentally changed their diplomatic standing. Until that point, the 1938 Munich Agreement, the pact where Britain and France had allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, was still a legal, if shameful, reality. The British government had been hesitant to formally repudiate it. In the wake of Anthropoid and Lidice, that hesitation vanished. On August 5, 1942, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden wrote to his Czechoslovak counterpart, Jan Masaryk, formally declaring the Munich Agreement null and void. The French National Committee, led by Charles de Gaulle, followed suit a month later. By striking at Heydrich, the Czechs had proven they were not passive victims but active combatants. They had paid in blood for their seat at the table of victorious Allied nations and, in doing so, secured the legal foundation for the restoration of their pre-1938 borders after the war. Edvard Beneš's terrible gamble had paid off, diplomatically at least. The traitor's reward and the collaborator's fate. In the dark morality play of Operation Anthropoid, the fate of the traitor, Karel Kurda, stands as a chilling postscript. For his betrayal, the Gestapo paid him the promised reward, though he received only a fraction of the millions advertised. He was given a new identity, Karl Gerhardt, a German wife, and a quiet life as an administrator in Prague. He lived out the rest of the war in relative comfort, a ghost haunted by the faces of the comrades and patriots he had sent to their deaths. His collaboration was not unique. The manhunt for the assassins was aided by numerous Czech collaborators and informants, driven by fear, greed, or fascist sympathies. These individuals became a crucial, if loathsome, part of the German security apparatus, their knowledge of local language and customs invaluable to the Gestapo. The most visible face of collaboration was Emanuel Moravec, a former Czech military officer turned fanatical Nazi sympathizer, no relation to the heroic Moravec family. As Minister of Education and Public Enlightenment in the Protectorate government, Moravec's voice filled the radio waves, urging Czechs to cooperate with their German masters and denouncing Beneš and the assassins as criminals. He became the most hated man in the nation, the Czech Quisling. The day of reckoning for these men came in May 1945, when Prague rose up against the German occupiers in the final days of the war. As Soviet and American armies closed in, the edifice of collaboration crumbled. Emanuel Moravec, attempting to flee Prague with retreating German forces, found his car stalled in traffic. Recognizing that his capture was imminent, he committed suicide with his pistol. Karel Kurda's fate was less dramatic but just as final. He was found after the war, his new identity failing to protect him. He was arrested, put on trial for treason, and when asked by the judge how he could have betrayed his comrades, he reportedly replied, "I think you would have done the same for 1,000,000 marks." He showed no remorse. On April 29, 1947, Karel Kurda was hanged in Prague's Pankrak prison, the same facility where the Gestapo had tortured and executed so many of his victims. His name became, and remains, a byword for the vilest form of betrayal in Czech history. The technology of the ambush, a closer look. The success and failure of the attack in Holsovas can be analyzed through the lens of the specific equipment used. The weapons supplied by the British SOE were a mix of standard-issue items and bespoke creations, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. The primary weapon, Josef Gapsik Sten Mk2 submachine gun, was a marvel of wartime mass production. Designed for simplicity and low cost, it could be manufactured for about £2, or less than $10 at the time. It was light, easily concealed when broken down, and fired the common 9mm parabellum round. However, its reputation for unreliability was well earned. The simple magazine design was prone to jamming if the feed lips were even slightly damaged or if the magazine was loaded with its full capacity of 32 rounds. Experienced soldiers often loaded only 28 to 30. It is believed that Gapsik's gun failed to fire because of a feed jam, a catastrophic malfunction at the worst possible moment. This single technical failure transformed the entire nature of the operation from a swift execution into a chaotic firefight. In contrast, Jan Kubis's weapon was a piece of specialized SOE craftsmanship. Officially designated the Grenade, Hand, Anti-Tank, No. 74, it was commonly known as the sticky bomb. It consisted of a glass flask filled with nitroglycerin, encased in a sheet metal shell coated with a powerful adhesive, and protected by a detachable cover. The theory was that the user would pull a pin, remove the cover, and slap the grenade onto an enemy vehicle, where it would stick before detonating. However, the early models were notoriously dangerous and unreliable. They could stick to the user's uniform, fail to stick to dusty or wet surfaces, and sometimes detonated prematurely. For Operation Anthropoid, the SOE modified this design. They removed the sticky casing and created a powerful impact grenade by shortening the handle and modifying the fuse mechanism of a No. 73 grenade, packing it with a potent charge of plastic explosive. It was a custom-made weapon for a specific purpose, to destroy a soft-skinned vehicle and kill its occupants. While it failed to land inside the car, its explosive power was more than sufficient. The detonation, while not instantly lethal, propelled the shrapnel and upholstery fibers that would ultimately cause Heydrich's fatal infection. The mission thus hinged on two pieces of technology, one that failed catastrophically, and one that succeeded in a way nobody could have predicted. The human element, motivations of the assassins. To understand Operation Anthropoid is to understand the men who carried it out, not just as soldiers, but as individuals. What drove Josef Gapsik and Jan Kubis to undertake a mission from which there was virtually no chance of survival? Their motivations were a potent mixture of patriotism, personal conviction, and a soldier's duty. Both were young men whose lives and careers had been violently disrupted by the German occupation of their homeland. Gapsik, born in Slovakia, had watched his nation be dismembered and turned into a Nazi puppet state. Kubis, from a farming family in Moravia, saw the Czech lands fall under the jackboot of the Protectorate. They were part of a generation that had been robbed of its national future. Their escape from occupied Czechoslovakia to join the Free Army in exile was in itself an act of profound defiance. In Britain, they were not merely refugees, they were soldiers in waiting, burning with the desire to strike back. Colonel František Moravec, their intelligence chief, selected them for their disciplined and energetic natures, but it was their unwavering sense of purpose that truly set them apart. They were not fanatics in the ideological sense, but their patriotism was absolute. In their letters home, they never hinted at the nature of their work, only at their commitment to the cause. There is a telling archival anecdote from their training period. When their British SOE instructors detailed the mission, they laid out the immense risks and the likelihood of death. They gave both men 24 hours to back out, with no dishonor. Both Gapsik and Kubis returned the next day without hesitation, their resolve hardened. They were not glory seekers. They were avengers acting on behalf of a silenced nation. They understood that their deaths were a near certainty, but they had accepted this as the price for demonstrating that Czechoslovakia was not defeated. Their personal survival was secondary to the symbolic resurrection of their country's honor. This cold, calculated acceptance of their own sacrifice is perhaps the most profound and humbling aspect of their story. They were the living embodiment of their nation's will to resist. The strategic calculus, was it worth it? The question of whether Operation Anthropoid was worth it has been debated by historians, politicians, and the Czech people for decades. It is a question with no easy answer, a grim equation where a single Nazi life is weighed against thousands of Czech ones. From a purely military perspective, the operation's value is ambiguous. It did not shorten the war by a single day. It did not destroy a German division or halt production at a major armaments factory. Its impact was primarily political and psychological. The fiercest critic of the operation during the war was, ironically, the domestic Czech resistance. Leaders of the underground had explicitly warned the government in exile in London that an attack on a high-ranking Nazi like Heydrich would trigger reprisals of a scale that their fragile networks could not withstand. They were tragically correct. The post-assassination terror effectively decapitated the organized resistance in Bohemia and Moravia, wiping out years of clandestine work and silencing a vital intelligence-gathering network. For the remainder of the war, resistance in the Czech lands was largely muted, only re-emerging in the final days of the conflict. However, Edvard Beneš and the government in exile were playing a longer game. Their calculus was not based on immediate battlefield gains, but on the post-war political map of Europe. They feared that if Czechoslovakia was seen as a passive victim, liberated solely by foreign armies, its claims to its pre-Munich borders and its national sovereignty would be weakened. The Allies might once again be tempted to use Czech territory as a bargaining chip. Operation Anthropoid was a deliberate act of blood sacrifice. It was designed to prove, in the most dramatic way possible, that the Czechs were an active and unbowed member of the Allied coalition. The repudiation of the Munich Agreement by Britain and France was the direct, tangible result of this strategy. By sacrificing their bravest men and, by extension, triggering the sacrifice of thousands of their own citizens, the government in exile secured the legal and moral high ground for the post-war restoration of their state. In this cold, brutal geopolitical calculation, the assassination was a success. It bought political legitimacy with the currency of Czech lives, a terrible but, in Beneš's view, necessary transaction. The architect of terror, deconstructing Heydrich. To grasp the full significance of Operation Anthropoid, one must understand the man who was its target. Reinhard Heydrich was no ordinary Nazi governor. He was the quintessential desk murderer, a highly intelligent, ruthlessly efficient bureaucrat of genocide. His biographer, Robert Gerwarth, aptly titled his book Hitler's Hangman. Heydrich was the organizational prodigy behind the Nazi police state. It was he who chaired the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, while Gapsik and Kubis were hiding in Prague, where he methodically outlined the logistical plan for the final solution to the Jewish question. He was the bridge between the ideological hatred of Hitler and Himmler and the industrial-scale implementation of the Holocaust. His mind was a cold filing cabinet of death warrants, transportation schedules, and extermination quotas. In Prague, his strategy was known as Zuckerbrot und Peitsch, whip and sugarloaf. He brutally crushed the resistance and intelligentsia with one hand while placating the working class with increased rations and social benefits with the other, effectively undermining popular support for the underground. His death was a significant, if not fatal, blow to the Nazi apparatus. While the machinery of the Holocaust was already in motion and would continue under his successors like Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's unique blend of intelligence, ambition, and utter lack of moral restraint made him irreplaceable. No other Nazi leader possessed his specific talent for organizing terror on such a massive, systematic scale. His assassination removed a key architect at a critical moment in the implementation of the genocide. Furthermore, his death sent a psychological shockwave through the Nazi leadership. Until May 27, 1942, the highest echelons of the Third Reich had considered themselves untouchable, insulated from the violence they inflicted upon others. They moved through occupied capitals with an air of invincibility. Anthropoid shattered that illusion. It proved that even the most powerful and well-protected members of the SS were vulnerable. It forced the regime to look over its shoulder, to divert resources to personal security, and to acknowledge, however briefly, that they were not gods, but mortal men who could be made to bleed. The aftermath for the survivors, a partial justice. While the principal actors were dead, the story of Operation Anthropoid did not end in 1945. For the few who survived the war, the traitors, the tortured, and the families of the fallen, the aftermath brought a mixture of justice, sorrow, and remembrance. After the liberation of Czechoslovakia, a series of people's courts were established to prosecute collaborators and war criminals. Karl Hermann Frank, Heydrich's deputy and the man who oversaw the Lidice and Ležáky massacres, was captured, tried, and found guilty. In 1946, he was publicly hanged in the courtyard of Pankrak prison, in front of a crowd of 5,000 onlookers. It was a moment of profound catharsis for the nation. Kurt Daluich, the SS general who succeeded Heydrich as Reichsprotector and continued the reign of terror, met the same fate. The lone survivor of the Moravec family, Vlastimil Moravec, who had revealed the hiding place under torture, returned from Mauthausen concentration camp. He testified at the trial of Karl Kurta, providing a harrowing account of his family's last moments and the Gestapo's brutality. His life, however, was forever shattered by the trauma and the impossible burden of his coerced confession. He reportedly struggled with alcoholism and died in the 1970s, a tragic figure haunted by the ghosts of his past. The women of Lidice who survived Ravensbrück returned to find their homes, husbands, and most of their children gone. The post-war government built a new village of Lidice near the site of the old one, but the scar on the landscape and the national psyche remained. The story of Anthropoid became a cornerstone of national identity, a testament to both heroism and suffering. Monuments were erected, streets were renamed, and the crypt of the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius became a national shrine, a hallowed place where visitors could descend into the subterranean darkness and touch the scarred walls where the heroes made their final stand. Archival legacy, the voices from the past. Our understanding of Operation Anthropoid is built upon a foundation of carefully preserved archival material, declassified documents, and personal testimonies that allow us to piece together the events with remarkable clarity. The British SOE files, now held at the National Archives in Kew, London, provide the mission's blueprint. Within these formerly top-secret folders are the training regimens, equipment lists, and after-action reports written by the RAF pilots who dropped the teams into the darkness. They reveal the meticulous planning and the inherent uncertainties of clandestine warfare. In Prague, the Czech Military History Institute and the Security Services Archive hold the darker side of the story, the captured Gestapo files. These chillingly bureaucratic documents detail the manhunt, the interrogation protocols, a euphemism for torture, the lists of executed persons, and the property confiscated from the victims. It is within these German records that one finds the original report on Heydrich's autopsy, detailing the fatal horsehair fibers, and the signed orders for the destruction of Lidice. Perhaps the most powerful archival sources are the oral histories and memoirs of the survivors. The post-war testimonies of the women of Lidice, the accounts of resistance members who narrowly escaped the Gestapo's dragnet, and even the trial transcripts of collaborators like Kurta provide the human texture that official documents lack. These voices bridge the gap between historical fact and lived experience. The physical locations themselves serve as archives of brick and stone. The hairpin turn in Holsovis, now marked by a striking memorial depicting 3 defiant figures, still forces traffic to slow down. A visit to the site is a visceral experience. One can stand where Gapsik stood and see the short, desperate distance Kubis had to run. The cathedral crypt, its walls still pockmarked by SS bullets and the whole blasted by German engineers, is perhaps the most powerful document of all. To stand in that cold, damp space is to hear the echoes of the final battle, a testament to courage that transcends time and needs no written translation. The enduring echo, a legacy of defiance. Operation Anthropoid was more than just a successful assassination. It was a statement. It was a small nation, dismembered and brutalized, shouting its defiance into the face of a seemingly omnipotent tyranny. The legacy of Gapsik, Kubis, and their comrades is not measured solely in the death of one of history's great villains or in the political concessions it wrung from the Allies. Its true legacy lies in the realm of the human spirit. The operation demonstrated that individual courage and sacrifice could challenge the foundations of a totalitarian state. It served as a potent inspiration for resistance movements across occupied Europe, from the Maquis in France to the partisans in Yugoslavia. It was a reminder that no dictator is truly safe, no regime truly invincible. Today, the story of Anthropoid remains a vital part of the Czech and Slovak national identity. It is taught to schoolchildren as a defining moment of modern history, a complex and tragic episode that encapsulates both the depths of Nazi evil and the heights of patriotic heroism. The debate over its cost continues, a healthy and necessary national conversation about the price of freedom and the nature of resistance. But there is no debate about the courage of the 7 men in the cathedral. In a world often defined by shades of gray, their actions were a stark and unambiguous declaration of principle. They were sent to kill a monster, and they succeeded. They were hunted, betrayed, and cornered, but they never surrendered. In their final moments, in the flooded crypt, surrounded by an army, they chose a self-determined end, a final act of control in a world that had tried to strip them of everything. This is their enduring echo, that even in the darkest of times, in the face of impossible odds, the choice to fight, the will to resist, remains the ultimate victory. The archives are now closed.